Well, good morning, everyone. I appreciate everyone coming out, and I'm excited to share our story with you. As I said, my name is Derek Peine, and I work for Western Plains Energy in Oakley, Kansas. Extremely excited to share our story, and particularly how sorghum fits into that, and how sorghum is a provides a strategic advantage for our company. We heard from the previous speaker that the ethanol industry in the United States is under pressure, and that's true. We have poor margins, and as was shared, a lot of plants are in negative net income situations and have been for several months. For our company, we've been able to survive, and we're not in negative income, and part of that is due, or a lot of that I think is due to sorghum and sorghum availability. My particular background, as mentioned, I went to Kansas State University. I'm native to Kansas. Have worked in the grain processing industry for my entire career. I started out with Cargill, worked in a number of grain processing operations there, and I moved over into the ethanol industry after that. Within the ethanol industry, I've been very fortunate to hold some very unique positions or have unique opportunities. Those have included doing the development and pre-engineering work for ethanol plants. I worked at an ethanol plant after it was initially built and managed the production on the startup, and then also engineered and managed the expansion, or the first expansion for that plant. After that, I was afforded the opportunity to move to Australia and manage a grain sorghum ethanol plant over there for a time. And about 6 years ago, I was blessed with the opportunity to move back to Kansas, move back to the United States, and manage Western Plains Energy. When we look at the broader ethanol industry in the U.S., the industry makes just over 16 billion gallons a year. Of the 16 billion gallons a year, about 90% of that is used within the United States in our own gasoline pool. We blended, our gasoline, as was mentioned earlier, is blended with 10% ethanol. The other 10% is exported outside the United States. The vast majority of the ethanol in 200 plants across the U.S., the vast majority is produced with corn. There's only a handful of plants that are located in places where sorghum is produced that they can use corn and sorghum. And of those plants, we're probably one of the plants that runs the highest percentage of our feedstock as sorghum compared to most of the other plants, even the ones that can get sorghum. So again, part of that reason is the strategic advantage. A little bit about our company. We started up in 2004. Again, we're located in northwest Kansas. Some of the advantages around that, we're probably also known as one of the most financially successful ethanol plants in the country. A couple of the reasons for that is we're located in a very rich grain area, a small pocket in northwest Kansas where there's 50 to 60 million bushels of grain, of corn and sorghum grown generally, and we're using about 17 to 18 million of those bushels. We're also located where there's a lot of beef feedlot cattle. There's enough cattle that it puts a very strong demand on our distillers grain, and so we only have to market our distillers grains locally. We do not export anything out of our area. And third, we're located along a main railroad line that gives us very competitive access to Western markets, in particular the California market. When we look at where our location is, you can see we're about right center of the United States. And it's a little hard to see, but the green boxes show where the sorghum is grown in the U.S., and you can see we're right in the middle of that. Kansas, as we heard earlier, is the largest grain sorghum producer in the United States. We grow just over half, typically over half of the sorghum for the U.S., and our location gives us great access to that sorghum at a competitive price. So let's look at some of the advantages and disadvantages to using sorghum as it relates to ethanol production. First of all, we heard earlier that sorghum is more resilient to drought than corn. That's important to us for our location. We live in an area where it is dry. We live in an area where drought is a threat every year. This year we've been really blessed with a lot of moisture, but most years we're wondering sometimes if we're going to get enough rain or not and how that'll affect the corn crop. So sorghum offers us an alternative for those years when there's poor weather. It offers us a different grain than most other ethanol plants can use because we have it available and they do not. We also heard earlier about the Ogallala Aquifer in Texas and how that's being depleted. That's the exact same aquifer that we use for our irrigation, and our corn crop in our region is highly dependent on irrigation. 25+% of our acres are irrigated for corn. So in the event that we don't manage our aquifer and groundwater levels very well, one of these days we could wake up and not be able to irrigate anymore. And so I look at sorghum as a great alternative or a great backstop in the years that happens. It also offers us a diversification that if we have a disease or drought or whatever affects one crop, we have a second crop that we can rely on. Sorghum is also an approved feedstock for advanced biofuel production. What that means is within our federal system, if we use sorghum and do a couple other things, we can potentially get an added value for our ethanol over anybody that's using corn as their feedstock for ethanol. And finally, sorghum has a higher protein, naturally higher protein than corn. Usually, when you look at distillers' grains and their corn or their protein profile in corn, it's maybe 30% on a dry matter basis. Our protein, when we use a lot of sorghum, is usually 2 or 3 percentage points higher than that. Now, today we're not capturing that value, but that's an advantage we're working on how to figure out how to capture the advantage of. There are disadvantages as well. In the U.S., one of the ways we measure carbon intensity, or the main way we measure carbon intensity, specifically for fuel, is this model they call the GREET model. And the GREET model today, since 2016, has a little bit of a disadvantage for sorghum over corn. I'm not sure that I believe it's all science-based. I think a lot of it is based on bureaucracy and politics, but that's the world we live in. So whenever we create a sorghum-based ethanol gallon versus a corn-based ethanol gallon, and we sell that into a market where the GREET model or the carbon intensity matters, there's a slight discount that we have to take for those ethanol gallons. There's also the challenge, and we heard about it in the last presentation, that the sorghum crop is much smaller than the overall corn crop. The slide that was up said 2% is what it'll be this year. So sorghum will represent 2% of the total corn market. That's a challenge for our market, and Dr. Welch talked about it also, on imports, and this trade war has had a big effect on the pricing for sorghum and the effect that has on our markets. At times where sorghum is priced higher than corn, we're not going to pay extra. We're not going to be able to compete to do that, to buy sorghum. So we will run a lot more corn in those years. And in years where there's trade wars, sometimes you can see there's a lot of sorghum available and then it's gone. And then there's a lot available and then it's gone. It can have a drastic effect on our day-to-day business. It's hard for us to figure out procurement strategies. Also, when you look at the crop size compared to corn, it's also a disadvantage in that it attracts less attention for research and applied innovation. So I see those as the disadvantages. And using sorghum to make ethanol has not always been easy. And it's something we've learned to be successful at as an industry over the years. Excuse me. If you look back 10 or 15 years ago, it was widely known that ethanol was sorghum was a disadvantaged feedstock for ethanol production. It created less ethanol per bushel of sorghum compared to the same bushel of corn. We had to add an extra chemical, an extra enzyme to help break the starch down into sugar. We had additional maintenance costs that we would incur by running sorghum because it was more abrasive. But today that's different. Today we create sorghum-based ethanol with the same yields with no additional costs and no additional chemicals. So we've turned that around and now looking for ways to use that as our advantage going forward. The other big thing you had heard 10, 15 years ago is that the cattle feeders don't like it. It was a substandard feed compared to corn. They wanted you to offer it to them at a discount compared to corn-based distillers. In our region, we've changed that perception. One of our largest distillers, or our largest distiller's customer, is one of the largest cattle feeders in the country. Today, we get the exact same price whether it's a sorghum-based distillers or corn-based distillers. And they feed it the exact same way, and they don't change their rations. And I talked to the nutritionist at this one of the largest cattle feeders, and he says they see no difference in performance between the two. So again, a lot of that is learned over the years, a lot of innovation in our industry to get there, and a lot of acceptance with the cattle industry to get there. This is a chart I threw in here for a couple reasons. One, you can see, and it's a little hard to read, the red bars at the bottom is a percent of sorghum for every month along the year. The yellow bars then are the percent of corn. So if we're running 20% corn, we're running 80% sorghum. And you can see how that's changed over the years, how it changes month to month. Again, that's a function of markets, a function of trade, drought. We heard earlier that sorghum exports are really high in 2014. And at one time in our region, sorghum prices were $1 more per bushel than corn. So consequently, we ran very little sorghum at that time. This last year, we've been running a lot of sorghum, a high majority of sorghum. What will next year bring, or this coming crop year, I'm not sure. It looks like our region's going to have good sorghum and good corn. My preference is to run as much sorghum as we possibly can, but markets are going to dictate it. The chart above is our conversion yield. How many gallons per bushel, how many gallons of ethanol do we get per bushel of input grain? That's input corn and sorghum. One thing you'll notice is that yield line is going up, constantly up. Now someday it'll probably flatten off, and maybe we're getting there. But that's an indication of the innovation and the work that's gone into our industry to make ourselves more and more efficient. The other thing you notice is as sorghum and corn ratio at the bottom, that feedstock ratio changes, we don't see that show up in our yield. Again, just an indication that we've learned how to use sorghum over the years, where 10 or 15 years ago there had been a definite difference between the two. So I talked earlier and I mentioned earlier that I see sorghum as a strategic advantage to our company. And this is kind of the nuts and bolts of why that is. Certainly we look at price in everything we do. And typically sorghum is 20 to 30 cents per bushel cheaper than corn in our region. Sometimes it might be 40 cents. Sometimes it might be $1 over. Last year there were times it was 80 over. It all depends on the markets. If we can continue to buy grain 20 to 30 cents cheaper than our competitors can buy corn, then we're going to do that every day of the year. That 30 cents a gallon equates to about 10 cents a gallon advantage to us in ethanol sales. And for those of you that are familiar with fuel markets are traded on the pennies and not on 10 cents. So 10 cents is a big advantage to us when we can get it. I also talked about feedstock diversification. I like the idea of having two feedstocks. For those folks that can only use corn and only have corn available to them, specifically in the eastern corn belt in the U.S. this year where there's a drought, they have no choice. They either pay really high for corn, or they're going to slow down, or in some cases they're going to shut down, and shut down for the entire crop year. By having sorghum as an option, I'm hopeful that when our turn for the drought comes around, we'll be able to survive, or be able to survive better than they are. Also, as market changes, we're offered, as a trade, this trade issues we've been experiencing, as that pushes sorghum high or low, we're able to adjust and run on either one and change our marketing. It's not easy, and it's painful, but we can change. And the last thing, kind of goes along with that is just the politics. The U.S. political system is full of politics today, specifically around trade, and it makes it hard for us to figure out how to manage that. But sorghum has been an important part of that. The last thing I'd share is around distillers' grains. I mentioned earlier it has higher protein. Are there other ways, can we take advantage of that protein and get paid for that? I'm not sure yet, but we're working on it. There are also other constituents within sorghum or the sorghum distillers' grains that might have better value than the corn, or different products than the corn distillers' grain might have. They both have oil. We're all extracting oil out of our distillers' grain. Are there other value-added products within that oil stream that we can extract and get value that aren't in the corn, or gives us an advantage over the corn? And then the last item there, we've seen it earlier on another slide. Sorghum is non-GMO, it's gluten-free, it's an ancient grain. Those are all big, big words in today's culture and society. So from my standpoint, we are working and would love to figure out how to take advantage of those grains. How do we figure out how to get our product into something where they pay added value for being non-GMO or gluten-free or whatever the new buzzword is that sorghum fits. Corn cannot fit in that category. So that's kind of all I had for this morning. I appreciate your time.